Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our final office hours session. Today's session is focused on blended and remote learning policies and labor issues. This session is being recorded. You are welcome to stay for all or some of the session. We will share videos of all 3 of our office hours sessions very soon. Please look out for a post in P-Digest with links to those videos. Today, we have representatives from across our agency joining you to answer your questions. I would like to welcome Linda Chen, our Chief Academic Officer, Randy Asher, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Labor Policy, Karen Salamando, Director of Labor Relations, and Reese Dunn, Chief Strategy Officer in our Office of the First Deputy Chancellor. They will serve as our lead content experts today. They are joined by colleagues from across the agency who may support in addressing specific questions. In today's session, we will spend the entirety of our time answering your live questions. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through how to use our Q&A feature. Take a look at the bottom right of your screen. You should see a Q&A button. Click on that button and you should see a text box that allows you to type questions. You will also be able to see what your colleagues are asking. You can vote for questions that resonate with you by clicking on the thumbs up icon. We have 2 simple ground rules for today. Please ask questions only about the topics of blended and remote learning and labor, and please ask only 1 question per submission. As you vote on questions, we will address the questions that rise to the top of the queue and move down the list. We will answer as many questions as we can in the time allotted. Thank you very much. Here is our first question. If we don't have enough staff, can our in-person teachers live stream to the blended remote and fully remote students? Can I turn to you, Linda?
Thanks, Yvonne, and thanks, Jessica, for that question. I'll ask Randy to add on here, but live stream is possible, but it is important that the teacher is willing to do that. It is not something that can be forced or mandated, and we know that different teachers have different levels of comfort, and certainly would want to make sure that they have enough training and what they need to be able to do that if they are willing to do that. Randy, do you have anything else to add to that?
So live streaming is an option for the teacher in order to make it the easiest way and get the answer in a way that will make sure that we're not putting undue pressure on them to agree to it. I would suggest you let your chapter leader survey the faculty to determine who is willing to live stream and give you that information. And then based on that, if they have chosen to live stream, they are perfectly able to do so. There's nothing prohibiting it, but we cannot mandate it.
Thanks, Linda and Randy. Our next question, if blended in-person teachers are willing, can they teach their blended students on remote days instead of having a blended remote teacher teach them on these days? Linda?
I'm going to kick that to Randy just because there's some labor nuances on that one.
So with the agreement we wrote with the UFT, it's to try and program your teachers to teach one modality of instructional delivery wherever it's practicable. So what that means is if somebody's teaching remote students, they should try and teach a program where they're usually teaching remote students. If they're teaching on-site, you want to try and maximize the number of on-site students that they're serving, since you may have limited faculty on-site. Where it's not possible to have just one type, we still want to minimize, but yes, it is possible that they can teach students in both modalities. There are some scheduling challenges to do that, but it is possible.
Thanks, Randy. Our next question, will teachers and or students be required to have their cameras on for synchronous remote instruction?
So I'll start with this one and other folks can add in here, but synchronous remote instruction, as everyone knows, can be in different forms, right? So it can be video where we see each other in the same time, in real time or live time. It can also be in like on the phone if needed to be, and it can also be with apps that are being where there's interaction simultaneously between students as well as between student and teacher. So obviously in those cases, there's not a camera involved. I will say that from lessons learned in the springtime, I know I heard from students and families and teachers alike in terms of the social emotional aspects and the different ways students learn. I think it's always best practice to be able to establish expectations. Of course, having cameras on is great, but there are times where a student may, and this is not about lowering expectations, it's about knowing your students and being able to determine when is a day that a student needs to have their camera off, or they're going through something in particular, but they're attending and they just have it off. And those would be the things that we would want them to establish. I just want to open up to anybody else in case, especially early childhood folks as well, if there are some best practices that folks want to share.
So, Linda, this is Alicia from Early Childhood. Just to add on to what you've already put out there, we do promote interaction in early childhood. And so whilst we can't mandate that you use the camera for synchronous remote learning, we do know that the younger the child is, the more important face-to-face interactions are.
Thanks, Linda and Alicia. Our next question is, when will we have a school year calendar?
Randy, do you want to address that?
So based on the most recent announcements on changing the start of the school year configuration, we had a long meeting yesterday with our labor partners at CSA and the UFT. We have a draft calendar that we're finalizing, and very shortly we should be releasing that. So it should come out momentarily.
Are schools going to receive PD materials for the time between 9/8 and 9/15?
Yes, thank you for that question. Schools will receive PD materials for that time. So they'll be in the form of the topics around health and safety, social emotional learning and trauma-informed care, as well as curriculum instruction aspects and blended learning. And for the most part, most of those things will be a resource for schools to use. We are working with our union and our labor partners to finalize the rest of that. I don't know if Randy, you want to add anything else to that?
No, it's a work in progress. There are materials coming in, but there's additional materials still under development and procurement.
Thank you. Our next question, what is the plan if there are not enough teachers to staff a building as of September 21st?
Randy, do you want to talk or actually Vicki, right? Vicki, do you want to talk a little bit more about what our plans are?
Sure. Thank you, Linda. This is Vicki Bernstein from Human Capital. Thank you for the question. We know that many of you are trying to ascertain whether you have enough teachers, and many of you completed the survey indicating supplemental staffing needs. Colleagues in the Office of the First Deputy Chancellor are reviewing those now. In many cases, they may be contacting you to get more clarity on your requests. Based upon that, we are, as you know, asking many of the central and field offices and divisions for opportunities for redeployment of staff who have instructional and pedagogical backgrounds, and we hope to have those redeployments and assignments finalized in the next week, so you can begin working with those teams and those individuals in your buildings to plan for their working with your students. We also know that many of you still have funded vacancies, as well as indicated that you may have a need for additional, maybe able to create additional vacancies. We are continuing to assess the hiring restrictions and whether there is a need to lift any additional restrictions. We announced some additional exceptions last night and will continue to do so. So please stay tuned for opportunities to consider additional staff who may be coming from external hiring pools, and your BCO HR director can support you in making access to those pools of people, both internal candidates through the excess staff selection system, as well as to external candidates. I also want to just reiterate that we've opened up nominations for substitute teachers. We know that's not a replacement necessarily for a full-time teacher, but we anticipate, as you may, that there may be additional day-to-day coverage needs. And so we encourage you to nominate substitutes so that we can get them on board and add them to the existing pool of substitutes. And this is something we're obviously taking very seriously and are continuing to work with colleagues in the Office of First Deputy Chancellor and with labor to make sure that you have adequate staff to serve your students and your programs.
I would just add that if this is Reese from the First Deputy Chancellor's Office, if you were not able to fill out a survey and the survey is now closed, please escalate that to your superintendent so they're aware, because that's the group through the district review teams that are looking at those requests that are coming in.
Thank you. Our next question, if a school does not have students on a particular day, does the staff have to come into the building?
Randy, do you want to respond to that? There was some discussion about that.
Sure, there was a lot of discussion on this yesterday, and some guidance is forthcoming on allowing teachers who have a remote program to work remotely on the days where that's applicable. So more guidance will come out on that in the next day or two in terms of specifics on different variations and scenarios, but the answer is no, they do not necessarily need to come into the building. From a health and safety lens, we're trying to limit travel, limit occupancy where that's practical. And again, the guidance is forthcoming on how to handle those scenarios.
Thank you. Our next question, when do we have to officially give our teachers schedules?
It's nuanced. I mean, I know that you're working to program your schools currently, and the current guidance, we were trying to make sure that families were notified by essentially today, and hopefully if it's not today, that it'll be Tuesday right after the break, just so families were aware and could make proper changes if they needed to for childcare and whatnot. And that was the intent, just so they knew what days, what kind of program model you're going to use and what days of the week they were expected to be in school. For your teachers, we recognize that's still some shifting pieces that need to occur. I don't know, I'll ask Randy if there's anything else I'm missing on when teachers need to know their schedules.
So Karen Salamando can speak to the details on the date that they should get it, but I also want to reiterate that you can split up the information. The actual formal schedule on you have this period 1 and this period 7 is one piece, and that's really what they need. But more important is the courses that they're specifically going to be teaching, even if you're finalizing the master schedule, because they want to start to do that prep work. So as long as I know I'm teaching this course or these 2 courses, what period of the day is a little less significant, they still need that information, and we want to get it to them as soon as possible. But the preparatory work that they need to do in advance of school opening, especially given the accommodations and other things we're dealing with, you may have some teachers teaching courses that they have not previously taught. So the more lead time you can give them to begin that work, the better.
Sure, just to add, so the contract doesn't really talk about deadlines at the start of the school year. Really, the deadlines are in the spring for the issuance of programs. And given the sort of different programs that are going to exist for September, to be honest, I'm not really that worried about grievances or anything along those lines with respect to the issuing of programs. I think it's really going to be dictated by common sense and making sure people have sufficient lead time and prep time to get ready for additional assignments.
Thanks, everyone. Our next question relates to special education. Are we permitted to have only one Gen Ed blended in-person teacher with all of the students, Gen Ed and students with disabilities, on days that students are in the building? Or must a second non-SPED licensed teacher also be assigned to the class on these days?
Thank you for that question, Nadine. We've certainly been working on supports for that and clarification, and John Hammer from Special Education is on to provide you with some guidance on that.
Thanks, Linda. So the goal absolutely is to staff a certified general education teacher and certified special education teacher as the blended in-person pair to the greatest extent possible. If the school is able to do that, there is not a requirement that a special education teacher be staffed as the blended remote teacher for that class. However, we understand that schools are undergoing lots of staffing challenges right now. And if your school is not able to do that at this time, you should staff a general education teacher as the blended in-person teacher for that class. You should staff a certified special education teacher as the blended remote teacher for that ICT class. And you should continue to work to identify a certified special education teacher to co-teach with that general education teacher through the means that you typically do.
Thanks, John. Our next question, can a teacher live stream their classes? If yes, what are the conditions for this?
So I believe we responded to that earlier, but it is possible for a teacher to live stream their class, but it needs to be that they willingly do that, and it's not an expectation or mandate placed upon them. So I don't know if there's more to that question, but that was what our response was earlier. Should we move on to the next one, Yvonne?
Absolutely. There's still no guidance regarding the paraprofessional workday, the length, etc. Is the expectation that paraprofessionals will do student busing from 2 to 250, for example?
Randy, do you want to provide some updates on paras?
Sure. We're negotiating right now with our labor partners around the actual duties of a paraprofessional and what they can and can't do in terms of their workday. That configuration has not changed based on the existing contracts. And something I want to mention to everyone is just real quickly, all of our existing labor contracts are intact. So the original contract for CSA, the original contract for the UFT, and all relevant components are still in play with minor exceptions on things that we have signed agreements around. Things like the new instructional guidance for blended learning, things like rolling over annual leave days, which impacted all of our principals and others that are 12-month employees, and some things that we've done on suspending the grievance process in lieu of a more expedited dispute resolution process we use on a committee. So those are really the only three modifications. Everything else, the existing contracts are in play. So based on the existing para contract, that determines the length of their workday and the configuration of what they can do. If we reach an agreement with the union to modify that, we will release that information to all principals as soon as we have it in hand.
Thanks, Randy. This next question is about reasonable accommodations. If a staff member has not been approved but has submitted an accommodation request, do they report to work on Tuesday?
Vicki, can you address Joe's question?
Sure. We are continuing to get in applications for reasonable accommodations and have been turning those around as quickly as possible. And we understand the urgency, particularly for your on-site pedagogical staff to do that. And so we anticipate being able to provide responses as much as possible to same day, even through today. But in the event that someone in your staff and your community has not gotten in a determination on their application as of Tuesday, we think you should use your discretion to the extent that they can access the required professional development and organizing that can be done off-site, that you give them that consideration. And if there's a particular need for us to prioritize a review, you can contact we'll put this in the chat email, and we'll try to prioritize that review. We are, again, trying to move these as quickly as possible. I just want to note, I know this is challenging for you all, but under the legal guidance, we can't close off the applications for reasonable accommodations. So these may continue to come in on a rolling basis. We will continue to keep updated rosters available to you through your principal's dashboard as much as possible.
Our next question, what are we doing about thousands of kids who don't have devices for day one of school?
I'm going to ask our CIO, Anurag, to address that question.
Sure, thank you. So we have recently made modifications to the remote learning device report, which is available and accessible to all the schools. On that report, what we're asking schools is to submit requests for devices on behalf of their school community for students who still need devices. We have certain inventory of devices still left to be distributed, but we also wanted to give schools a chance to see where they were also proactively going ahead and giving devices to students based on the inventory they had within the schools. Once we have all this information back, we'll have a very good sense of the demand out there and if there is still a device gap, and we'll take next steps from there.
Thank you, Anurag. Our next question is about blended and remote teaching. If the blended in-person teacher or the remote-only teacher is willing, can their classes be composed of blended and remote students who join classes synchronously, whether in the building at home, given that a pedagogue would supervise students in the building if the teacher of record is working at home? In other words, the question is, can a teacher teach blended and remote students in the same class at the same time?
I'll start it and then I'll kick it over to Randy. We know that for principals, you're dealing with very specific details and permutations at a school level. And so while our guidance in agreement with the UFT was trying to maximize teachers teaching in one mode, if at all possible, mostly because we want our teachers to be able to do the very best that they can. And managing two different modes is harder to do. Although I know that it does provide more continuity for students. So our guidance has been that when possible, you're trying to assign teachers to one mode. We know that there's some extenuating circumstances in school buildings where that may or may not be possible, but I want to make sure that we also consider the specifics of labor in this. So Randy, I'm going to ask you to just add on to that.
Sure. So I'm reading this as actually two different questions. So one is, can a teacher teach using multiple modalities for delivery? And the answer is yes, but limited as much as possible, as Linda just described. The second way I read the question is, if I'm doing blended remote, can I mix those with fully remote students? And the answer to that is generally no. However, as we described earlier on contracts in place and the modifications based on these recent memorandum that we've signed off, schools will still have the option to do SBO votes if you need to deviate from the things that we've agreed upon or from the original contract. So that's a way that you can look to customize things that may work better for your particular school setting. Programming under the best of conditions is incredibly complex. Under these conditions, it's nearly impossible in certain scenarios. So there is a vehicle by which the chapter leader and the principal can work together and bring it to the staff to say, we think this is a potential solution that may resolve these issues. So you'll be able to move that forward, and we'll have some additional information on SBOs coming out shortly, especially some potentially pre-approved SBOs that we're negotiating directly with the union.
Thank you so much. The next question, if a teacher is home due to COVID symptoms, can they still teach remotely?
Vicki, do you want to address that question?
Sure. Thanks, Linda. Thanks for the question. Absolutely. If someone is home due to COVID symptoms, but they're still able to work, and you're able to provide them access that they might need to the classroom, to the students, they can still work. If that means that it's very limited in the work that they can do, either because of their own health condition or because of their inability to access, you don't have to have them work. They might be eligible for an excused absence for that day. More information is going to be forthcoming about all of the COVID timekeeping and leave policies. That should be in the Principals Hub early next week as well, including additional guidance about when teachers or any staff have symptoms and the conditions under which they can continue to work or take leave.
Thanks, Vicki. Our next question relates to special education. If we are able to establish the 40-60 ratio for blended and remote sections now, but then parents switch students from blended to remote or from remote to blended, what do we do if there are more students with disabilities than general education students in remote or blended?
Thanks for the question, Nadine. And we know that things will constantly shift throughout the course of the school year, and appreciate you working hard to establish that ratio. I want to just kick it to Christina to give a little bit more guidance on that, but I think that there's some times where you have the plan in place, and if that shifts, we want to make sure it's not a constantly shifting situation. So Christina, can you talk a little bit more about how Nadine could ensure that she's demonstrated that she had planned for that?
Absolutely. So a couple of ways to answer this question, Nadine. The first is, as Linda said, of course, things are going to be changing and moving. And in terms of the specific scenario, every school is going to have different resources in terms of staff available. So in this scenario, I would recommend that you work with your director of special education to review the staff that is available, the way that you've programmed, and what the composition of your ICT classes look like, and ask that your director of special education and AZ support you in reorganizing as you need to. Of course, the special education compliance team is also always a resource, and those folks work alongside of your directors of special education, and we can support you in that way as well as the central special education office. But my first go-to, because of the unique needs of every school, would be the director of special education and my AZ.
And Christina, Our next question, please clarify the number of students the remote teacher and the blended remote teacher can be assigned.
Randy, do you want to take this labor question?
Sure. If it's a fully remote class, it's capped at the normal class sizes appropriate for that grade level. So if it's a high school, it's 34. If it's a middle school, there's an appropriate number. If there's an elementary school, there's an appropriate number, etc. If it is a blended remote class, the agreement we recently reached with the UFT had a bunch of different components to it. And we can't pick and choose. All of those pieces need to be implemented if you're going to use it. And that is in the morning, excuse me, in the morning you have the collaborative planning time. There's an office hours period. There's a remote prep that they can take. There's a truncated, that prep period is truncated, etc. If you put all of those pieces in place, then the class size for the blended remote teacher can be up to double the number of students they could ordinarily teach at that grade level. And the concept behind it is during that blended remote time, they're using pre-created materials by our virtual content specialists or things they create themselves, doing small group instruction, some whole class as possible, and partnering with the teacher who's the on-site blended teacher so that they are both responsible cumulatively for the same number of students they would have been responsible in pre-COVID programming conditions. So the blended remote teacher and the on-site teacher, between them, should be able to share twice the number of students that they normally would have served individually.
Thank you, Randy. What is the expectation regarding instructional time on the remote days prior to September 21st?
Randy, can you give the latest agreements with the union on this?
So we have a calendar that's in final development based on yesterday's meeting. We are in the process of shaping that, and we'll release it most likely in the next day or two. That talks about instructional time requirements. Basically on the 16th, 17th, and 18th, there are some instructional requirements that we need to make it an official instructional day, and the details on what needs to be covered and how to do that will be coming out shortly.
Thank you. So we addressed a question earlier about students and camera use. Now the question is about teachers. Can we require teachers to have their cameras on?
Randy, do you want to address that?
We cannot require it. We can discuss why that would be appropriate in certain settings if the teachers are willing. So there are times when using the camera is a powerful tool, but like all tools, they need to be used in appropriate circumstances, and the teachers need to be comfortable with it. So there are some teachers who will be comfortable and some who will not, and it's also a day by day. It doesn't mean they will always use it, and it doesn't mean they will never use it. So that's at the discretion of the instructor.
Thank you, Randy. In documents talking about monthly faculty meetings and grade team meetings, they say that they are 40 minutes long, but can't go past 2:30 p.m. How are we relieving teachers to have a grade team or faculty meeting if they are with students? Until 2 p.m., we do not have the capacity to do that.
Randy.
So on these type questions, we would recommend that you reach out to Senior Field Counsel for guidance on how to schedule it. But there is nothing that says that on faculty and departmental grading conference days that it can't go past 2:30 p.m. So I'm not sure where that was misinterpreted, but the faculty and department meetings, if you're on a 6:50 schedule, are in addition to the regular teaching program. What we recommend is on those days, hold that meeting before the prep period so that the teacher can leave and still have the remote independent prep period as we originally agreed. But if you need additional support on that, you can have conversations with your senior field counsel and they'll help you navigate it.
Thanks, Randy. This is another labor question. When will we find out if we are receiving any redeployed teachers?
Vicki, can you address that? And if Reese, you want to weigh in as well?
Sure, and I can defer to Reese. As I mentioned earlier, the Office of the First Deputy Chancellor teams are reviewing the survey responses you submitted on your supplemental staffing needs right now in conjunction with looking at the availability of redeployed staff. And so I think that we anticipate making some matches ideally early next week, but that may go out over a period leading up to the 21st. I would ask Reese if you have anything to add there.
Oh, I mean, they're looking at the data live and trying to assess the need, and they may be following up as well. But I know the superintendent teams are starting to meet as district review teams to look at all those requests. We recognize there's urgency, and we're just trying to sort through the information that's come in to better figure out how we can redeploy staff and get that information to you timely.
Thanks, Reese. Policy says that teachers can leave the building 30 minutes early to complete their prep period remotely. If all students have left the building, can other titles, paraprofessionals, secretaries, school aides, etc., leave the building and perform the rest of their work remotely as well?
Randy, can you address that one?
Sure. At the moment, the answer is no. The ability of teachers to take that remote prep was part of a negotiated arrangement on taking a truncated prep to 30 minutes instead of a full period in return for the ability to choose to do it remotely where they choose to. It's important to note that some teachers, even though they can do it remotely, may choose to take that prep time on site because of materials, equipment, and access. So that's still an available option for them. At the moment, the other titles do not have such a provision.
Thanks, Randy. What is the contingency plan if multiple teachers are out sick in one day and substitutes or pedagogical staff are not available to cover? This principal asks, does he combine pods, for example? Does he have a school aide or a secretary cover?
Reese, can you start with that, and then maybe Randy can support around some labor considerations?
Yeah, I'm trying. So the contingency plan to figure out when folks are out. So I think on the podding question, I don't have the answer. I think we need to follow up with health and safety on that unless anyone's on the call to address. I think for general coverage, that's where the many of y'all have submitted needs for staffing, and that's what they're currently going through to assess to see if you have enough staff to do it. I don't have, unless I'm misunderstanding the question, I don't have an answer on the combining pod piece, so I want to defer until we can follow up with better information.
Any other additions to that question?
So I guess what I would add on this is in emergency conditions, if you have to put another adult in front of a group of children, the primary consideration is making sure students are supervised and that we're maintaining health and safety protocols for social distancing, etc. So you may be able to use some of your larger spaces to keep kids socially distanced, but still in a supervised setting. I would not recommend using some of the other titles unless you have to. I would do it in a cascading order based on people who usually interact directly in the supervision of students in a classroom setting. So your guidance counselors could certainly assist there, but that should be the fallback position. So you have 6-period coverage if you need it. You have administrators you can deploy. But this is really about the emergency condition because teachers called out sick on the same day. If it's a sustained staffing shortage, you should reach out to your BCO for support.
Thanks, Randy and Reese. What remote teaching professional development is being provided?
So thanks for that question. We have a number of different professional development resources available. There are some that are made available through DIIT in terms of leveraging technology tools, how to set up Google Classrooms, those kinds of things. There's also from the Curriculum and Instruction Office, work around the priority learning standards as well as learning maps as a way to coordinate across teams the syncing and the scope and sequence of teaching lessons so that there's more seamless interaction across teachers in terms of certainly a number of schools will have that team teaching approach. Part of the remote teaching professional development resources will also include being able to maximize the instructional coordination time. That was something that we came to an agreement on with the UFT, and we want to make sure that that is maximized and supports that seamless experience for students. And I think I mentioned earlier too, there will be resources for trauma-informed care as well as social emotional learning. And we're finalizing with CSA and UFT in terms of which pieces are required. We all want to make sure that there's flexibility for all of you because you have particular needs at your building that you will need to address as well as the resources to support you. So what you will get is a number of resources that you can use, and we're right now just determining which are the ones that everyone does need to get, so that you know exactly where you have room to move, and if you want more resources, those will certainly be there for you.
Thanks so much, Linda. This next question is about synchronous instruction, specifically about teachers. Is there a maximum amount of time that a teacher can engage in synchronous instruction with various groups? The instructional guidance provides ranges of daily synchronous instruction for students, but does not reflect the range for teachers. So as an example, a kindergarten student should be engaged for approximately 65 minutes. What is the teacher doing for the remaining time? Can I create a schedule for the remote classes?
So it's always under the principal's purview for schedules and supervising that. But it's a good question. In the summer school guidance, we talked about teacher time, and in the guidance we've put out, it's focused on student time, mostly because we want to ensure that there's continuity and consistency for every student's experience across the city. And to that end, yes, we did put minimum and maximum times for students. For teachers, the maximum is their scheduled contractual workday, right? In terms of, if you take out the instructional coordination time, the office hours time, so that's 50 minutes right there. If you take out their duty-free lunch, as well as their prep, the balance of that is essentially the teacher's contractual time, where would be the maximum of what they could spend synchronous. Now, having said that, I just want to make sure that we're also clear that a student's learning experience is a complementary, set of the asynchronous and synchronous time. So in order to ensure that there's the best learning possible, we want to make sure that we have requisite amount of time for students to be able to do both, and teachers to be able to have the time to switch from one group to another. So we also put out guidance, as you'll see, by subject, by grade level span, around students coming not always like this, where the entire class and everyone's together for video conferencing, but the teacher would have sometimes the whole classes together, generally around access to grade level content and a mini lesson, if you will. And then there are other small groupings that would happen throughout the day, and that's what teachers would be able to do, as well as one-to-one conferences or office hours for students as well. That also counts as synchronous time. What I would recommend is to support teachers in how to do that and provide that guidance, because we know that families come to you as to what the expectations are and the degree that principals can support and help do the scheduling there. I don't know if Randy wants to add a little bit more on just in terms of the labor aspect of schedules.
No, I think your description was right on target, Linda, is that you have to configure the time on what makes sense to serve the students. And it's going to evolve and need to be fluid throughout the school year. As you're doing different units, it may require more synchronous or more asynchronous, and you may need to break the groups down differently. So I think it needs to stay fairly flexible as this continues to evolve.
Thanks so much. If a student has a health mobility paraprofessional and are fully remote, are they still entitled, to that para?
So I am going to answer this programmatically from a special education perspective, and then I'm going to toss it to Randy on the labor front. So yesterday we put out guidance on the PAD, the program adaptations guidance, which asks that, just like we did with the remote learning plans, we connect with families and talk about the needs of students during remote learning. Of course, if a family feels that their student can be supported by that paraprofessional and needs the additional support, we would want that to be put in place. Other families will certainly say, I have no need for the mobility para while my child is at home. Thank you, we're doing fine, in which case that should be documented on the PAD. As far as the labor negotiation agreements with the UFT, I defer to Randy on that regarding further guidance.
So we're still in discussion around paraprofessionals and duties that they're able to perform during their workday. I think on this question, again, it's driven by the IEP and the guidance that's been distributed, but we may be able to reallocate. So that's an ongoing discussion with the UFT.
Thanks, Christina and Randy. Our next question is about teacher evaluation. When can we expect to receive guidance on teacher evaluation?
So I'll start, and Randy, feel free to add anything else. We are working to align to the state's expectations. We know that this is a big question, and rightfully so, both for the feedback and support that's needed, as well as the evaluation piece. But it will be forthcoming. We do need to work on this, both in aligning with the state's expectations as well as working with our labor partners as well.
Thanks, Linda. Our next question, Randy, you responded to earlier, but let's repeat it for folks who just joined the meeting. When will paraprofessional guidelines be released?
So the good news is as soon as they're complete. So we're in negotiation with the unions as we speak. Literally daily, we are meeting with our labor partners at CSA. We're meeting with UFT to put out the working rule protocols on what they can do. Until such time as we release anything new, the existing labor contracts for how paraprofessionals can be utilized are currently in play.
Thanks, Randy. When can we expect for the virtual specialist to be hired, assigned, and working with our teachers?
So thank you for that question. And the virtual specialist is a key capacity in the space that we're in. We are working to get the posting agreed upon and to be posted. It is a stipended position. It is also a centralized posting. So we will be working to coordinate with these specialists across the schools. These are teachers who are teaching and then doing some additional work aligned to particular curriculum areas. And then it is also, when the centralized posting goes up, can be leveraged for schools, if they so choose, to be able to do on their own and self-fund as well.
So Linda, if I could just add on, the virtual content specialist position may also be staffed by supervisory staff. So it is entirely possible, especially at the high school level, where a subject area supervisor might take the lead in that type of role, again, as a stipended position. So it's just something to keep in mind, and the postings should be available.
Thanks. This question relates to special education. Can you please clarify the newly released guidance on ICT classes? It appears that if a special education teacher is unavailable, we can assign a general education teacher. Isn't this a violation of students' IEPs?
Thanks for the question. And yes, please, I just want to note, refer to the most recent guidance that went out in P Weekly, P Digest, excuse me, yesterday evening. But I'll have Christina provide some clarification on that so that we're clear.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to take it from the top on this one. Regarding ICT, every effort should be made, including the reassignment of special education teachers with school-funded out-of-classroom positions, to assign a certified special education teacher to a classroom. In the instance, however, if a school has insufficient certified special education teachers teaching on site, we are asking that schools either seek a substitute to provide those special education services in the classroom, and we are also encouraging schools to use to staff the blended remote teacher position with a special education teacher so that that teacher can support the special education needs in the classroom. If the only option is to put another general education teacher in the classroom, certainly that is up to the school's discretion. We would very much encourage in that particular scenario that the blended remote teacher be a certified special education teacher, if there are two general education teachers in the room. And the point being is that we would want the blended remote teacher to provide the specialized instruction support and the special education collaboration to those general education teachers. So staffing the other position, the second position with a gen ed teacher is an option. But again, if that were the case, we would encourage schools to staff the blended remote teacher with a special education. That person should be a special education teacher. If it is not possible to put a second educator in the room, we would want schools to try to identify a substitute who has a certified special education license and use the COVID-19 related school staffing request form to submit a request for COVID related staffing needs. In that scenario, again, we would encourage the blended remote teacher to be a special, we would encourage schools to staff, if at any way possible, the blended remote teacher should be a special educator. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Christina. Our next question, how many periods are teachers allowed to teach in a row when they are in person?
Randy, can you provide the specifics on that?
Sure. So under normal conditions, you would say no more than 3 in a row where you can set it up that way. If you're doing block programming, the 4 in a row would be permissible, but you're going to have to make some accommodations and allowances if the teacher needs to use the restroom and other things. And I'm going to defer to Karen Salamando if there's any other subtle nuances that we want to weave into this, but there's flexibility on how we make this work.
Yeah, the only other nuance I would add is that those rules really apply to middle and high schools and are not applicable to elementary schools.
Thank you. Our next question, do teachers have to do the 20-minute communication time immediately after school, or can they do that later after they have arrived home, as long as they communicate a regular schedule of availability for students and parents?
Randy, can you provide labor clarifications on that one?
Sure. So the 20-minute parent communication was never meant, was never meant to be an after-school activity, but it was supposed to be built in as office hours during the workday. If you as a school community want to allow them to do that remotely, I think that's an individual localized decision, but keep in mind it should be something that's monitored to make sure that they are doing that parental outreach.
Thanks, Randy. Do we have to maintain programs like dual language and gifted and talented, or can we combine all students across a grade level? That would allow us to free up some staff members to teach our remote groups.
So we do have our Deputy Chief Academic Officer, Mirza Sanchez Medina, for the Division of Multilingual Learners. I'm going to have her talk a little bit about the dual language aspect of it. And I would just say, to sort of frame this, we know that you have to work out a number of different scenarios, and there may be some extenuating circumstances in terms of the ratio of teachers and students in building and so on, that you have to consider some flexibilities. I would encourage you to stay very much connected with your families and with your superintendent for support as you consider some of these flexibilities. For dual language, the reason why I want Mirza to address this a little bit more, especially in the cases where dual language is the service that's being provided for students identified as English language learners or multilingual learners. And then on gifted, remember, it's also a program that students have been accepted to. What I would say is, if you are seeking some flexibilities around this, I would really look specifically at dedicated small group time or something where there is still a way. Again, I don't know what the absolute sort of circumstances here in your situation, but if you're looking at flexibilities, I would recommend staying closely in touch with families around what those flexibilities are, but making sure that you're delivering on at least dedicated small group instruction in the areas for gifted and talented. Mirza, do you want to address dual language specifically?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Linda. I want to add or emphasize on the piece of honoring the family's requests, because obviously families signed into these programs, and then adding again, emphasizing what Linda said about the E&L services that must continue to be delivered. And we understand the difficulties of programming and trying to group students, but it's important to have the conversation with the families and also to continue to deliver the E&L services because those are mandates. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for just 2 more questions. Who is contractually obligated to supervise the isolation room?
Randy, can you address that?
Sure. So contractually, the answer is anybody you as principal designate that needs to go into the isolation room. In practicality, what I would recommend as a best practice is identify all of your instructional times, whether it's time block in an elementary school or by period in a middle or a high school, and put together a cadence of if that period the room needs to be covered, who would be doing it. Have that pre-established so that you know what the working rules are and who would be doing it. One of the things you should look toward is who is actually flexible to be able to do it. So it's very hard to assign a teacher to cover the room because they're teaching most of the day. Their lunch is supposed to be duty free. The prep time is needed. School aides can cover the room. We should solicit who you would utilize and have that conversation with your team at the local level. You can use other personnel. It could be supervisory, it could be support staff. But I want to be clear, when you're supervising an isolation room, it doesn't mean you're on lockdown with the child in the room. It means you don the appropriate PPE and need to supervise the student within visual range. You could be looking through a glass door, you could be on the other side of the room. So picking the room and having an appropriate space is important, and identifying how to make sure that happens in a safe way is also important. But given the circumstances, if you have to designate somebody, it's an on-site decision on who can do it. I would say it can't be the nurse. That was one of the conversations we had because that makes them unable to attend to any other scenario in the building at that time. And remember, the isolation room is a short-term solution while we're waiting for a parent to come get that child. So immediate parental notification should happen if you have to isolate a student.
Thanks so much, Randy. And our final question for the session, are teachers working from home allowed to have their children present while they're teaching, assuming they are doing childcare at home as well?
I'll take a stab at this and open it up for others here, but I do think that we certainly know that these are different times, and that is certainly a need. I don't know how we would not allow that, but I don't know if Vicki or Randy want to add on to that if they're doing their job.
Yeah, I think, obviously in the spring, as already happened, and you've probably experienced yourself, you all have to make accommodations for trying to find as best a space as possible to be able to do the work that you need to do at the time you need to do it to serve students. And so no one can control for kids, dogs, etc. But teachers should be asked to make arrangements within their own homes to make sure that they have the dedicated time and space and privacy as much as possible to be able to do their work.
Thanks so much, Vicki and Linda. Thank you so much for all of your questions today. We will be posting today's video as well as videos from our first 2 sessions very shortly, and you should look out for an update in P Digest about where you can find that link. We will also do our best to communicate with superintendents about where we are putting any follow-up materials so that they can follow up with you. We will look at some questions that we were not able to answer and try to compile some common questions and responses to follow up to these sessions. Thanks so much for your time. I'm going to turn it back to Linda to close out.
Really, I just want to say thank you. We have just great and deep gratitude for your leadership and your resilience. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have. It's also been great to be able to connect many of you to each other with the great ideas that you have. So many of us on this call are former principals, and we have not, though, led in your shoes and through the course of a pandemic. And we just really want to, thank you so much for your efforts. And we are working day and night to make sure you get the answers that you need, and feel deeply strained, and conflicting that we can't always provide you everything that you need to know, but know that we'll always share with you what we do know. And we so appreciate your leadership, and we've seen you bring teachers together, your community together, to really be able to ensure that our students have a strong in-person experience as well as virtual experience. And in terms of being from my space as the Chief Academic Officer, I also thank you for pushing through to make sure that teaching and learning happens in whatever context students and teachers find themselves in, and beyond all of the important health and safety measures as well. I appreciate you constantly keeping your eye on the prize with that as well. So thank you so very much, and have a great weekend. Please feel free to reach out to us.